Traditional Affairs Minister, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma. The former health minister is seen as a central figure in the prohibition of liquor and tobacco sales during lockdown, with recent reports suggesting that she had pushed for the ban to continue until level 1. Now, to discuss this further, we're now joined via Skype by political analyst Prof Dirk Kotze. Prof, thank you so very much for joining us here on SABC News. Right, well, the question of who is in charge in government seems to pop up every now and then. Take us through what has driven it this time around, and if that is, if that conversation is indeed justifiable of who is in charge.
I'm not sure that it is actually justifiable, because what we are seeing here is that different levels of decision making with respect to the pandemic. At the top level is President Ramaphosa. That's when he announced the final decisions, like what we are going to see tonight again. And he is advised by the National Command Council that he established. But at the second level is the Minister of Health and the Ministerial Advisory Committee of about just over 50 members that deal specifically with the health components, of the virus and the epidemic. And then at the third level is, and that is where we see a lot of the activity, is at the level where regulations are coordinated. Now, we've seen now, and more information is coming through of how, for example, the cabinet clusters, and there are a number of clusters there, but in this case specifically the economic cluster is coming together, or has come together, to discuss those aspects that affect their portfolios. And they then forward those decisions to the Command Council and ultimately to the Cabinet.
Yeah.
So in order to see everything in one pool, I think will be unfair. At the level of the regulations, the third one, as I mentioned, that is where Cooperative plays the coordinating role. Now, if you go back to the Disaster Management Act, it is, in terms of that act, the act is specifically saying that one minister in the cabinet must be the coordinator of all of this. So all the regulations, the more and less popular regulations, ultimately comes back to Dr. Dlamini-Zuma, because Cooperative is the coordinating ministry and department that must bring together all these regulations. So whether she is therefore seen in a very, very prominent position is in a sense expected to be the case, because she is in that coordinating position. She often is in negotiations with individual ministers about specific aspects. A good example of that was, for example, when the export of wine was, the prohibition on the export of wine was lifted. And the Minister of Agriculture, Toko Dodiso, was clearly in negotiations with Dr. Dlamini-Zuma about opening up that, making that possible for the agricultural sector in general. So one has to look in between the lines and not merely look at the end result, whether there's a ban on tobacco and cigarettes or not. I would argue it's a very crude way of looking at it.
Yeah. Prof, of course, you know that opposition parties have taken to the courts to challenge some of these lockdown regulations. And of course, you speak about Minister Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma. What is your view on the fact that we have these parties who've decided to go to the courts to challenge her and to challenge what they perceive to be her regulations, in fact?
Well, again, and it links with what I've just said now. I think she is ultimately the responsible minister in terms of the legislation. So in that sense, it is justified that she is the one who must in the end respond to it, because many of these regulations are issued in her name also, together with the responsible minister. I think what is also from the side of the political parties and opposition parties, and there's different approaches between the DA and the EFF, for example, about it. But opposition parties is in a predicament, and that is that with the current lockdown situation, the fact that Parliament cannot meet in a physical sense, only in a virtual way, means that there's much less space for them in order to articulate their views on many things. And in a sense, they have been overtaken by not the ANC necessarily, but by government. And therefore, they have to fight back, in a sense, to win back space in order to make their views known and to maintain their media presence in general. And I think that is the reason why they have now linked themselves to some of these regulations. At the same time, they understand that some of these regulations obviously are not very popular amongst the public. And if they can link themselves to the sense of frustration that exists in public, they hope that will give them some support, that there will be more sympathy for them in the end.
Yeah. Prof, I mean, of course, you mentioned the issue of frustration, but one wonders, I mean, given the fact that this is all new to everyone, it's new to the government, it's new to the people of South Africa, we've never had to, well, in my lifetime anyway, have to deal with this sort of pandemic. Was there perhaps a better way in which government could have dealt with this pandemic that would have convinced those who are saying that the president is not in charge, that you know, he is indeed in charge? I mean, we've seen the Command Council, for example, that report to him. But is there anything more that could have been done on a government level to show that indeed the president is in charge?
I don't think so. I think one has to take a few things into account. First of all, the form of government that we have is not a presidential system. It's not like in the US or in France or any of the other, where the president is everything, where the president is in control of the decision-making in all respects, and ministers are simply there to serve him or her. In our case, we have more of a presidential, parliamentary system, which means it's collective decision-making. It's more of a cabinet form of decision-making and government that we have. So in that sense, it won't be appropriate if the president was the all-important person who took decisions on his own. At the same time, and this is something which is not really discussed in public, is if you go to the Disaster Management Act, the original act, then it stipulates a different institutional scenario than what we have actually at the moment. What the act is saying is that the Minister of Cabinet that is responsible for managing any disaster, and that is now in the case Cooperative, must be in control of everything. There's no preference to the president at all in that legislation. What we are seeing now is that the president has, in a sense, overtaken that act and established the Command Council and the Presidential Coordinating Council and other structures, which gives him the leading position in managing this pandemic. So in a sense, what we are seeing is a downgrading of the prominence of Dr. Dlamini-Zuma in terms of the legislation that's supposed to be implemented, and a more prominent position for President Ramaphosa, which is in line with what is happening in many other parts of the world. President Trump is taking the lead, though it is a federal dispensation there, which is much more decentralized, supposed to be, whether it is Boris Johnson before he became ill. In all these countries, the leaders of those countries are taking at the moment the lead. And in that sense, President Ramaphosa is in line with that. And therefore, I can't see any other way in which it could have been approached by the government.
All right, Prof Dirk Kotze, thank you very much for giving us your time. We really do appreciate your input this afternoon on SABC News.
Thank you.